This meeting is being recorded.
Fantastic. You heard it twice, hopefully. So that should make it clear. So welcome everyone to our weekly call. So good to be back in my home office this week. Just a quick reminder of our call agenda, which shouldn't come as a surprise, I hope, to anyone. So this week, Geoff, as you would have heard, Geoff Huston from APNIC is joining us, and he'll be reprising a presentation that he gave at DNS OARC last week on the resolvers that we use, which will, I think, be particularly pertinent to sort of projects like DNS for EU, as you will see and hear in a moment. So I thought it was an interesting presentation, and I'm hoping that there'll be a bit more time than was possible during OARC for people to ask questions if you have any. And then, as always, we'll pick up on some recent developments in the news, as well as forthcoming events, future topics, etc., and anything else that anyone wants to raise in the available time. So pretty straightforward this week. So let me stop sharing. And I'll sort of hand over to Geoff, who I think most, if not everyone on this call, will know, or certainly will know by reputation, as the chief scientist at APNIC, and a prolific author and presenter at a wide range of conferences. So Geoff, over to you. And if people got questions, if you post them in the chat or put your virtual hand up, and Geoff can determine whether he wants to answer them on the fly or we're picking them up at the end, whichever's easier.
Yeah, look, thanks, Andrew, and good morning, everyone, because I'm in California and it's morning, and you know it's so much better than midnight in the middle of winter in Australia. Yay! I'm pleased. I don't know about the rest of you. I'm very pleased. Look, feel free to interrupt at any time. When I share my screen, the chat window seems to have submarined, and I'm on a big screen and I can't see a damn thing about chat. So, you know, just interrupt. And as Andrew said, yes, if you're at DNS OARC after the IETF week on that weekend, this is something I presented on Sunday morning. So for some of you, like John, it will be the second time around. I'm sorry, but as Andrew said, you might have some more questions or thoughts about this. So feel free. I want to start with something that I never heard anyone say. Let
me just see. I'll mute Lars. Carry on, Geoff.
There, thanks. No one said this, but I am pretty sure a lot of folk in the policy world thought it, because some of the stats about which resolvers are used by whom tend to be worrying. And I would have thought it would have been almost adding 2 and 2 to make 4 to figure out that a huge number of folk in the EU appear to be using Google's public DNS service. And in fact, Google has a market share that is easily 5 to 10 times larger than its closest open DNS resolver competition, which is currently Cloudflare. The previous big incumbent, OpenDNS, I think it's Cisco's umbrella these days, is way down below that. So, you know, if people use a non-ISP resolver, it's Google. Now, the issue is you didn't sign a contract, you didn't sign an agreement, you didn't even click through anything. You just aimed your resolver at it and it gave you answers. And there's no contract. It's completely unaccountable. Now, that's interesting, but it's a fine service. And so far, Google said it's honest. It always gives you the answer that's in the DNS. It doesn't make anything up. And I've never heard anyone contradict that, bar operational errors, you know. But from an EU perspective, for example, if you're an EU policy person, then a whole bunch of your users, presumably in the hundreds of millions, are actually dependent on a US service which is completely unaccountable. Completely. It operates outside the regulatory framework. It hasn't signed any of the conventions that apply in the EU because it's a US company with a US domicile. And so this is essential infrastructure in another part of the world, operated from another part of the world, that a majority, not a majority, a large proportion of folk in the EU rely on. And it's not hard to come to the conclusion that this is unacceptable. This represents a risk that if, people start frowning at each other across the Atlantic, turning Google off in the EU would be a disaster from that perspective. This is not acceptable. And if I make up reasons for DNS EU, and this is just me, no one else, it's just me, that sentence, that all these sentences that nobody said, seem to me to be a strong motivation to say, got to change this, got to make the infrastructure more self-reliant, not just on the routes, but more self-reliant on infrastructure within the region in which we are, infrastructure that is accountable to us. So no one said this. I never heard this. I never heard it from anyone. Not even the folk on this call who we might have talked about this topic. But it strikes me as the obvious elephant in the room, But there's one phrase there that I thought was pretty fascinating. And it's something actually the Office of the CTO, Alan Durand at ICANN, also raised with me. Because it was sort of, what are you saying the resolvers we use? What does that phrase mean? And the more you kind of look at that, the more it actually raises questions. So if I wanted to measure this, if I wanted to measure the market share of Google, how would I do it? And once I'd sort of set up this measurement, what does the data actually say? So we came to this sort of thought process around 4 to 5 years ago in APNIC. We actually thought it would be interesting to actually look at the extent to which people use Google. So we actually run an online advertisement campaign. It's relatively massive. Ads are cheap. Ads are disgustingly cheap. And if you make the ad totally unappealing, it's even cheaper because you pay for a base impression rate and then you actually offer a bidding price for people to click. Now, if you make a really low bidding price, Google tries even harder to take your money away from you. So you tell Google, I want to spend, I don't know, $300 a day. And I don't care where you impress the ad. So I'm not after any kind of demographic. So you try and use blandness. And then you say, I'm going to offer a really, really low click bid. And so Google goes, you've offered $300, whatever you offered. It's my job, says Google, to take that money off you. Fine. And if people aren't clicking, I've got to impress the ad more. So at the moment, we're running around 20 million ads a day. That's a lot. But Google do something else, which makes this even more interesting. They try really hard to never give the same person the same ad twice, certainly not back to back, and certainly not within a 24-hour period. So when I say 20 million, it tends to be 20 million new clients every day. And so it sort of recurses through these billions of users who get ads, and our ad pops up. And I don't know if you've ever seen it, but that's probably the beauty of ads. It is widely smeared everywhere. Now, ads have scripts. They actually have HTML5. So as soon as the ad hits the browser, it runs the opening script. No clicks, just runs it. And this is where the measurement campaign comes in. Because as soon as that ad comes in, the ad is really skeletal. It comes back and asks one of our servers. We have 5 sites around the world at the moment, 1 in each continent, basically. It says, well, what should I do? And we go, well, here's a list of 8 or so tasks to do. Go do them. What are the tasks? Oh, that's easy. Get. Just to fetch. And so every single user has to fetch around 8 URLs. Now, each URL has a uniquely generated DNS name, which is actually a multi-component name. Google only let us use one label, and the label must end with a fixed component. Okay, so, and then a common suffix. So then everything ends in a 0. But before that is the time of day, a unique ID, where we've geolocated you, where we think your origin network is, and so on, and also what to do. And so the DNS actually becomes a piece of microcode that actually tells the server how to behave. Should this result be DNSSEC signed, for example? Should it be signed badly to give you validation failure, etc.? So we're running the server, and the query tells the server how to react. The name is unique, so caching doesn't work. And if you think about it, it's like this diagram on the screen. There's kind of a bit of a cloud, and who knows what happens between the browsing device where this ad is running and the last resolver in the forwarding chain. So let's just call that the recursive resolver. And of course, then there's our authoritative server that sees that recursive resolver. Yay. So I saw the user get the ad because I gave them a list of tasks. So I generated a unique ID, and I also know to some extent where they're coming from. To some extent because of private relays, VPNs, all kinds of strange teleporting things that happen on the internet today. But to some extent, I know roughly where you are. Sometimes very well, you're either using an IP address, sometimes less so, you're using a relay service, but okay. And I also then, from the queries that you make, see your recursive resolver, because someone asked me, and it's not you, it's your recursive resolver. And now I can start matching things together, who you are with the recursive resolver you use. And I can start to actually construct an experiment. So in this case, don't muck around. Don't delay, don't play strange tricks with serve fail or error codes. Answer immediately. Give it an A or a quad A, whatever it asks for, just give it what it needs as fast as you can. Make it small, don't muck around with large responses and fragmentation. And what we actually try and do is steer the users to the closest server we have. So whether it's in Dallas, Frankfurt, Sao Paulo, or Singapore, or actually Stockholm these days, we'll try and get you to the closest place so that the risk of timeouts is minimized but not eliminated. The problem is, though, that I know which resolver address asked me a question, but that doesn't get me all the way, because you might send your query to all 8s, yay, or all 1s, yay, or all 9s, or whatever you are, but that's not the backends. Now, some folk publish a list of backend servers and their idea of the server location. So Google publish it. I think Cloudflare publish it. I think I used Cloudflare, but others you've actually got to experiment. And the way we did this, oddly enough, is by enlisting the help of Atlas. So you do a worldwide Atlas run and say, send this particular query set to Quad 8, and then you sit there and look at the logs that happen going, who asked that question? Now, there are some oddities in Atlas. You ask Atlas to send this query to Quad 8, and there are a bunch of times when Quad 1 answers, or Quad 1 ends up asking the question. And it happens the other way sometimes too. All kinds of silliness at low volumes. But in general, this gives you a set of back-end IP addresses that map to the front-end resolver service. So when we don't get the map published, like Google, we just build it anyway. Now, I've got a bunch of IP addresses for resolvers and a bunch of IP addresses for clients. And I'm trying to actually do a taxonomy. So the first category is your network and the recursive resolver is in the same AS. It's the same network. Now, if you're using your ISP's resolver and your ISP's IP address, et cetera, you'll co-locate to the same AS. So let's call it same network, okay? I've now got this list of IP addresses for those open resolvers, right? So to some order, it's a known open resolver. Now, it's not a big list. I deliberately didn't take all whatever millions it is of open resolvers. There are a few lists of open resolvers. Most of them have a huge error margin, and they're mostly historic. But to be perfectly frank, there are about 5 biggies and a few also-rans. So, you know, there's Google, there's Cloudflare, there's Cisco's Umbrella. There's the one that Newstar trialed and didn't get very far. There's one in Taiwan, 101.101.101.101. Oh, there's Quad 9, that's a biggie. But then there's a whole lot in China, They're actually used in China. And it's almost as if the ISP industry has actually embraced open resolvers as distinct from users. It's all Chinese, not really sure what's going on. Okay. I'm now interested in a little bit of border crossing, because if you're not using an open resolver and you're not using the one in the same AS, are you in the same country or are you crossing boundaries? Now, the geolocation is MaxMind, long debate about how good MaxMind is, etc. You know, you take what you get. But I'm interested in same country code, and I'm interested in a different country code. Your queries start flying around the world. Interesting. So now what I do in this graph is I've pulled out all the users that have geolocated into the European region, into EU, one way or another. And the top line, the blue line, is the percentage of samples every single day since 2 years ago, roughly, this time 2020, who use a resolver in the same AS as the user is. So around 70%. Now, it's just one query, just one answer, in theory. And we'll get into why this is a bit weird. Google, using this metric of a single initial query, around 16% of the time, I see the question coming from a Google DNS resolver. Same country code, around 8%. And as I said, Cloudflare is most prominent, 4.74% or thereabouts. The other ones I look at are Newstar, OpenDNS, Level 3, and a few others. Right,
Geoff, real quick interruption. When you say same country code, do you mean a different AS in the same country code? Is that what that means?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Yes. So I don't put them in 2 buckets at once. But if you look carefully, I'm not sure whether that adds up to 100 or not. Maybe it doesn't. It shouldn't. It should add up to more than 100%. Why? Because the DNS. These names are generated on a single ad presentation that has a single unique DNS name. And so in theory, there should just be one query unless you time out, right? But that theory only happens for 30% of the samples. So one query, multiple presentations at the authoritative server, 70% of the time. And they're different. They're different addresses. So that 30% actually allows the same address to ask me twice or 3 times. You know, I'm just looking at unique addresses, not counting queries. So 2 or more queries are queried in basically 60% of the cases. And most of the time, these seem to be resolver farms. In other words, a cluster of engines that are in the same AS, right? But 10% of the time, it's being farmed out. And 10% of the time, multiple addresses, multiple ASs, which is weird. That's a cumulative distribution there. This is GNU plot scaling. Inside 15 seconds, there was at least one experiment where I saw that question from more than 100 different IP addresses. Great to be popular. I have no idea what's going on. As I recall, that one was in Taiwan. And they were all almost adjacent IPs. Either they have a room full of engines, interesting, or they have one engine and they vary the source IP address and they listen on a subnet, more plausible. and they've got their timers wrong. Really plausible because, you know, software. But the, you know, the extremities out there on the right in that cumulative distribution just raise some fascinating questions about why do you get such massive query replication between the stub and the recursive set. So multiple resolvers see individual stub queries is really what's going on. So we get 3.23 distinct resolver addresses on average in the first 15 seconds. So what do we do with them? If you query me from Google and from the same network and from a different country, is that a count of 3, or do each of those buckets get a count of 1/3? I actually made them all the same. So I actually add to the count. The more I get asked from different classes, the greater the count. And you kind of go, is that right? Is that the best way to handle this? And then I thought, well, actually, what's the question? So let's rephrase the question because it's not very accurate. So let's go all the way to one side and go, I want to know all the resolvers who might see your query. I want basically to time out all the time and to sort of get you to flush your etc.resolve.conf, get the recursive to flush every possible way of getting that question answered. And there's only one authoritative resolver. So it's not a list, there's only one to try, but there are many different paths between one user and one authoritative resolver, and that interior of the DNS, I want to flush out. Now, if I send back an error, like NX domain, it's likely that everything will stop. But we noticed in looking at DNSSEC that the one answer which makes the DNS curious is serve fail. Because as soon as you send serve fail, most recursives, or sorry, most sub-resolvers will actually cycle through everything. And they'll try all kinds of alternative ways to get to an answer. And so we set up an experiment where the result wasn't A or quad A. It wasn't the answer, it was serve fail. And we ran this again. And now the answers are interesting. Google rises by 10%. And there's certainly a strong indication that that relative rise is because there's a lot more use of Google on if all else fails. Even Cloudflare has now risen from 5% to 6% if all else fails. So these are the ones that you don't normally flush that appear when serve fail happens. And what you also find is the whole same network has dropped ever so slightly, because in the larger list, those alternatives tend to seek recursive resolvers further afield in their search. By the way, that's a daily graph. And as you see, there are peaks and troughs. Notice for the same network, it's basically 2 in 7. This is weekday, weekend. Notice for Google, it's the exact inverse. Weekdays are more common than weekends. Notice for same country, the profile is different. Notice for Cloudflare, where's Cloudflare? 6%. Less distinct, but if you look at it more closely, I can tell you that the answer is that Cloudflare tend to be more weekday than weekend, tend. So now I'm doing serve fail. And while I said the average was 3.23 unique IP addresses for each query, when you do serve fail, you actually find the number of folk who have multiple recursive resolvers in their list using different IP addresses. The number who have only one is now down to 12% of the time, and 2 or more different resolvers are queried in 30% of the cases, and most of the time they're all in the same IP address. The same AS, sorry, all those things are in the same farm. So you have resiliency, but only to the same AS. You don't feel further afield. Notice though that when you do serve fail in the first 15 seconds, instead of the peak at 100, there are corner cases up a little over 1,500 to 2,000. So the edge results of really hammering the server hard with the same question is actually way more prominent when you do serve fail. So I'm still not there, because although that's an interesting answer, who might see your query, there's sort of one more question, which is, whom do I choose to believe? Which again is the resolvers we use, but I narrow it down to, who am I depending on? Where's my trust relationship? Who's the first to respond? So I actually did a third pass at this, where now what I'm looking at is the first recursive resolver to ask me that question, because my authoritative server, is a relatively standard implementation. I answer in order. My assumption is, and it's not a bad assumption, you questioned a bit, but if I answer a recursive resolver first, the user will get that answer first. That's the thing resolved. Bit of hand waving, but not a lot. I did not try and give everyone different answers. That would get confusing to try and track what was going on. So it's always the same answer, but I'm just doing straight timing. And now I'm actually asking the first responder of the first question. And I get a somewhat different profile. I only did this across this year, but as you see, 70% are in the same network. Google is now actually below 16%. It's down another percent. The same country at 7%, Cloudflare too, slightly lower at 4%. That whole weekday, weekend profile, I've forgotten when Easter was, but I think it was around the end of March, is now quite prevalent. What you see is the peaks on the same AS on weekends. The peaks for Google are through weekdays. Google around 15%. Okay. So this is a summary of what you've seen, and it sort of raises that question. Because if you look at everything you could ask, 1/4 of the samples in the EU region head to Google at some point, possibly. In other words, Google could be used as high as 26% of the time, or it could be used 15% of the time. And while I'd argue it's not that dissimilar, it's enough to be significant, because the presence of Google inside this is, well, a lot fewer people naturally send their queries to Google, 16%, and even less are actually, that's the first query that comes along. Even less believe Google as distinct from believing someone else. But I'm still not happy. Because I think the question that was really behind DNS for EU was actually about the role and the relationship between public policy and consumers. Because that whole weekday, weekend profile actually points to the fact that there's a huge amount of enterprise activity, who get ads, by the way, that are quite happy to move away from the defaults, to actually set up their own DNS independent of their service provider. And there are fine reasons why enterprises do that. They can, their own interest in controlling the environment that they're managing, controlling even the spread of information. All of those enterprise issues come in enterprises, but they're not necessarily there in retail ISPs. They're not in the consumer market. So we know networks. We know what network you're in. Roughly. It's the origin AS of the IP you present on. So what if we put up a filter that says, here's a list of ASs in the European region, and these ones we know are mass market consumer ISPs, and these ones aren't. Let's cleave the two apart and look only at massive consumer ISPs in the EU region and get rid of all of those enterprise networks and the clients that sit behind them. Now, you might well ask, what did I do with Apple's private relay data service, where you might think you're running Safari on your phone, but the network believes you're coming out of Fastly, Akamai, or Cloudflare from somewhere else? And the answer is, I moved them out, because it's very hard to pick apart queries that come from Akamai and why. I don't understand the queries that come from Fastly or Cloudflare because of this whole issue of a mix of traffic all coming from the same sort of data center provider, CDN provider, rack in the data center. So these are all of that filtered out. These are just consumer ISPs with a massive number of clients behind them. So what do we see? 87% of users, 87% use the provider default in the consumer ISP sector. Slight profile now, higher on weekends than weekdays. That's probably the enterprise effect. So this SIFT isn't that accurate, but it's good enough. And now what you see is 6% are in the same country. There is a good example, I think it's Telia, where the DNS resolvers for their retail service are in a different AS. Why? I don't know, but they're in a different AS. And so it's kind of the same country and even the same operator, but that's about it. You know, they're just a different AS. Google, in those mass market ISPs, is now way down at 4%. And Cloudflare, which was at 5%, now down to 1%. So all of a sudden, everything has changed. And if I put this into with the first set of three sort of categorizations, you start to see what the consumers see is actually radically different from what that initial query set was. 70% of users are in the same AS. Well, 87% of consumers are in the same network. They use the defaults. 6% are in the same country, but a different network. Google is now only used by 4% of users because 4% at most change the defaults that have come from their network. And similarly with Cloudflare. So most of the time, most users don't change the defaults. They just don't. So what does this mean? Should the EU be worried? I don't know. But nevertheless, the observation is that changing your default DNS is only for the brave and for the enterprise. Everyone else goes, it works. I'm not touching anything. And they don't change a thing. There are some users who move slightly off-piste and actually use resolvers in different networks. And I think that's just the way service providers organize it. I don't think users themselves use a big thing about going to another resolver in the same country. If you're going to go that, apocryphally, I would say it's more likely you're going to change to all 8s, all 1s, all 9s for damn fine reasons, but you wouldn't necessarily go to a smaller one. And the picture for enterprises is now savagely different, because if you look at the difference between that first responder of the consumer ISP, for the enterprise customers to shift that data means that most enterprises, don't use the defaults. They actually do use the open providers. And these open DNS providers actually probably find the majority of their client base is actually queries coming in predominantly from enterprise sector who see reasons to divert their DNS traffic outbound. Now, what didn't we measure? How many different DNS resolvers see your query? I don't know. And it's very, very hard to measure. There is a new business, and Nominum is a player, but there are probably others who sell services to ISPs because running your own DNS is expensive. Help desk queries, yada, 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 a whole bunch of reasons. And if someone says, for a fee per query, very, very small, we will run your DNS for you, is very attractive for many ISPs these days. Very, very hard to tell if Nominum or Akamai, I think these days, is running a provider's DNS business or not. Can't tell from the outside. So whoever's operating that certainly is privy to what clients are doing. And it's not just which network gets to see the queries, but which operator gets to see these profiles. And we didn't measure who on sells, who, for example, like some of these network intelligence services, sell their query profile on. There's a whole bunch of security services that buy query profiles. And we didn't actually measure where these queries go to. But there is a way to find out who's collecting logs of queries and replaying it, because this question is actually interesting. Who keeps a track of what happens in the DNS and replays it? Now, this is an interesting log. It's a 24-hour period, just 24 hours. It was done a couple of months ago. And of those 612 million DNS queries we saw, 23 million were older than 1 hour. They were queries from experiments which were at least 1 hour old. And the experiment had long since, you know, the script, the ad, long since gone, long since. Now, that's a lot. And half of those were between 1 and 12 days old. That sort of bit in the middle. There's a fair amount that's actually relatively quick. And you kind of go, who's seeing this query, say, 1 hour after the initial presentation? Is it a log replay? Could be. Is it some other form of almost immediate analysis of the DNS live? Well, yes, it obviously is. And so the TTL is only 60 seconds. There's a large amount of replay happening very, very quickly. And not a large amount, but an amount of replay that is in the category of months to years. And so why do 4% of these queries occur 1 hour after the original event? There's a lot of folk looking over your shoulder one way or another. Some of it is fast log replay, but others is actually analytics trying to sort of replay what's going on to understand who's making what query for whom. It also says, when you're running an authoritative server, what's your traffic? How many of these users are live and how many are replays? Because we find that some days on our experiment, 90% of the traffic is old. Other days, it's more like this, around 4% of the DNS traffic is old. But that sort of ratio of old to current, because we get some days where someone is running a log again and again and again, and just hammering the hell out of our DNS servers, and other days are quieter days. So let me get back to the topic, because tracking me in the DNS is its own talk. But this one, you know, is this a problem? Because if it's around 4%, and even that 4% using Google, there's an enterprise component. There's still a weekday, weekend profile in Google. And so that 4% is still probably not a consumer issue. The majority of consumers in the EU region just use what ISPs do. And the real question is, in Europe, in that region, do ISPs send their queries to Google? No. In Africa, do ISPs send their queries to Google? Well, yes, a disturbing amount of the time. But that's kind of what is the ISP doing as distinct from what the users are doing in their search for a better DNS service. So no matter which way you cut it, whether for the EU or globally, there are some questions about that centrality of DNS resolution, questions about control of infrastructure, questions about privacy and where the information flows and who gets it, almost irrespective of what they do with it. And questions about, should users really be making DNS queries, or should we be looking at ways, if privacy is really the big thing that it is, should we really be looking at ways where users and their stub resolver libraries never actually make queries, where we try and bury it? Now, this could be through Apple's private relay data service, or it could be through other mechanisms such as resolverless DNS. And it really is an issue of how big is the problem? And I suppose the answer is, we're not sure. But at the moment, it certainly seems that most folk don't twiddle with the buttons, and most ISPs, they might do their own things with your queries, but they're not just ab initio. They're not just sending them all and forking it to someone else by default. That might change, but that's not the case today. So yeah, that was slightly longer than I took in DNS OARC, but it's probably a good time for questions. So I will stop sharing the screen, and if there are questions, happily chat about where we are and what we've learned. Thank you.
Thanks, Geoff. That was interesting as always. And perhaps whilst people are thinking, if you do have a question, either raise your virtual hand or put it in the chat and we'll read it out. But a sort of maybe a starter for 10. You said you excluded things like sort of private relay because it was too difficult, which is fair enough. Do you have a feel for sort of how much traffic sort of the Fastly, Akamai and Cloudflare represent that could, some of which might have been private relay?
In Singapore, by raw numbers, Cloudflare is now the biggest ISP in Singapore. That's saying a lot. And it's also saying nothing because they're not an ISP. And so everything I'm seeing coming out of AS13335 in Singapore comes from a combination of Apple's private relay and a Cloudflare service called Warp. And it certainly seems that while Apple's market share is not that high, around 8% or so of real users, there is a bubble of folk who have turned it on. And it's certainly distorting some of these efforts to find the real user. Now, Apple is good enough to give us a map of which country these IP addresses being presented to us can be attributed to. So even though the thing might appear out of Singapore, if they use a source address of 192.3.2.4, the user was actually in Samoa, right? And all the users in Samoa will present in Singapore from that same address. So there's still a certain amount of geolocation integrity going on. But after that geolocation integrity, all bets are gone. So it's good that Apple published that map, and I use that map. But beyond that, very hard to tell exactly, what's happening here.
Yeah, fair enough. Maybe one for the future. Right, we've got some hands raised. So I see in the order that they're raised, Brett, then Vittorio, then John, and you'll need to unmute to ask a question.
Yeah, so this is Brett. So thanks for the great presentation. I'm wondering if a lot of the duplicity of queries that you're seeing and also the replay is actually from security software doing, either real-time or post-mortem analysis of the traffic, trying to understand if it was a threat or what things were going on. Because I know a lot of security software, whether it runs on the endpoint or whether it's cloud-based or network-based, will look at the traffic and make its own queries for every URL that it sees being delivered to the endpoint or to the browser. And then it will try to do an assessment in semi-real time to, how risky is that site. And so that might be where you're seeing a lot of duplicative queries. And then also the replays. A lot of times the security software will retrospectively go back and rerun this to, try to do analysis, so you can say, okay, well, we know that this site is now compromised. What did we know about it a week ago, or how many, users went to that site? And so that's very common with security vendors and various security software.
These are good questions, Brett. And I did presentations on this about 6 years ago, and I'm thinking it's time I did this again. There are a number of axes that you can use to look at the duplicates. One of them is time. Who tends to come in straight away? Because I've got the time in the query when the query was manufactured. And so if someone's leaping in, someone external, within, a minute, that's different to someone coming back a month or a year later. And there's certainly peaks close to the original query, which tend to suggest a real-time fork of the DNS query, and then secondary processing, and then looking at it again to find out what it was, versus I collected a log of the day of some period and I'm replaying it. But there's another axis which I found fascinating, and I was looking for the NSA. I really was, and I didn't find them. but I was looking. I was actually looking at who makes that query. And yes, Amazon EC2 is a big player, but some folk use their own engines. Blue Coat is from memory. There are a few who actually are known security services that use their own engine to query twice. But I also noticed a huge amount coming from Guangzhou province in China. And then it was kind of matching the the browser that people were using and those queries that came from Guangzhou province. And there is a browser called Sogru that is used a lot by Chinese folk because it has a damn fine pinyin form of presentation, where every single URL you go to that's unique triggers a query from Guangzhou province within about 6 or 7 seconds, all the time. And so it's almost structural that this browser leaks like a sieve. That was the only evidence I found of that close degree of shadowing that's actually coming from the user as distinct from coming from the DNS infrastructure. But to be perfectly frank, this whole idea of tracking the query and the querier doing a time signature of lapsing actually gives you a better picture to sort of try and categorize the behaviors that you said were going on. And it's true. Looking at it from a security viewpoint, doing log analysis, all those kinds of activities are there as follow-up queries. Total query load of these duplicates, significant, and the other thing which is kind of interesting is, as far as I can see, is some of them replay through Google, some of them replay through a recursive resolver, and some of them directly query to the the authoritative servers and bypass all of the existing DNS infrastructure. Behaviors vary by who's doing the analysis, but it's a fascinating question and worthy of study in its own right. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks for that question. Next with his hand up is Vittorio, if you want to unmute Vittorio.
Yes, well, yeah, before getting to the question, of course, I'd like to say that your interpretation of the reasons why in Brussels they were interested in DNS for you is correct. And I think if you had a chance to have a chat, maybe in private, especially with the people there, you would hear that reasoning, maybe not even, not so much in terms of the accountability of a specific company, but in terms of having to prevent data from going outside of the European Union for data protection and localization laws and these kind of things. And so, and this also explains why, the actual percentage of current Google users is not so relevant, since this is seen as a strategic issue. But what I wanted to ask is whether you had any measurement of other user types, other user groups, how much they use let's say, the global resolvers. Because, of course, the first target user group for DNS for you is not end consumers, it's not the average user. It's the public administration. So the people that are most likely to be told you should use these, or maybe you must use these, are the various public administration organizations around Europe. And so I was wondering whether there's any measurement, because if the percentage is so low for consumers, lower than average, then I would expect that for these kind of organizations it might be higher than average.
It's an interesting question, Vittorio, and one that's worth a bit more thought. Let me start somewhere else, and I'll come back to this. For a long time, we noticed that in the regional internet registries, the Northern Hemisphere, and in particular Europe and America, were handing out 10 times the number of autonomous system numbers than was happening out of the Asia-Pacific area, which was basically North and South Hemisphere China, and in particular India and China. 10 times. Even though the populations, there was a greater user population and a faster growing one on the internet in Asia, the autonomous system number growth was basically in Western Europe and in America and Eastern Europe. And it led us to the belief and understanding that AS's networks were actually at a tighter level of granularity in North America and in Europe than in Asia. In Asia, China Unicom, China Mobile, and so on, is everything. Government, enterprise, consumer, it's all just smacked together. And your question is impossible to answer in the context of a country like China. Yes, I get ads in China, but can I break down those ads into what type of user? Really hard. When I moved to Europe or America, there's actually a diversity of granularity of AS. And yes, I have seen attempts not only to do consumer and enterprise, but consumer, business to business, data center, government, and a number of folk are actually now developing and probably marketing those autonomous system categorization. Now, once you go from there into this kind of data, which has the end IP address and the routing system smacks them together, you can actually get a decent view of the public sector and the resolvers they use. If you gave me, to put the rubber on the road, a list of ASs that you're interested in, you could do this. And more to the point, the reports that I produce on resolver use go down to a level of granularity of the AS. So if you plugged in an AS that you thought was government, this machine, the stats machine I operate at APNIC, will tell you what they're using, whether they're using Google, their own ISP resolvers or anything else. So yes, that intelligence is out there. What's kind of missing is the categorization of ASs, but I needn't do that. You can do it yourself. The system itself can answer that question for you with a little bit of digging around on that interface. I'll post that into the stats while John asks his question.
Great question. Thanks, Vittoria. Could be an illuminating answer as well. Okay, we'll close the queue after John, but John, do you want to come in with your question?
Sure. First, a quick comment is that I think you're correct that a lot of organizations, enterprises, et cetera, will use the open resolvers, not necessarily even for obvious reasons, but unobvious reasons like, well, I guess the first obvious reason would be something like security, where a local resolver doesn't provide you with secure, an ISP resolver doesn't provide you with security, and some of these folks are looking for, like in Quad 9's case, a security model or a privacy model. I guess my question is DNS mask. So I know DNS mask has the ability to fork queries and send them to two places at once. And I know that's a small portion of the market, but have you looked at trying to determine where the split is occurring, where these duplications are happening? Is it at the recursive resolver, or is it at the stub, or is it at a forwarding cache? Like, where is the divergence occurring? And then a layer of question on top of that, is that occurrence intentional or unintentional, and who is being spied upon? More interestingly, like when you see a divergence in queries going to two different places, if Google is your first respondent or Quad 9 is your first respondent, are you seeing it from somewhere else? And then can you infer anything about whether that's intentional or intercepted? That's really interesting to me. But again, where in the stack is the duplication happening, and is it intentional or unintentional, I guess, is the overall question.
God, you've got me thinking here, John. I wish I could make this data open and then I could just point you at the raw data. Google won't let me. And that's just a condition of the ads. I have an open door that shouldn't have been opened as widely, and I have confidentiality as a result. But you are right. If it's DNS mask, then it's interesting as to what mask is doing. If they're just duplicating to the same resolver, why would you bother? So it's forking quickly and forking diversely. So there's no timeout. Right. It's as if the query comes from two recursives almost immediately to the same authoritative. And you kind of go, wow, that's interesting. Yep.
And almost by implication there, Google is going to be slower because Google's almost in a different AS where your local resolver is in the same AS. So you're going to see one reaching you possibly slightly faster than the other.
Right. The other thing I was looking at, which clouds the data, is not all front ends for server farms are good. It's meant to load balance and not, it's meant to decide one query, one engine. Some of them get into states where one query goes to every engine, why thank you, or 5 engines at once. So I get 5 back to back in the same /24 in V4 or the same /48. And I'm seeing this cascade of queries and they all look about the same from the same part of the network. And that just seems like a front end, hiccup, and I'm getting replication. I would love to go down further into what's going on here. Like I said, my initial work was some 6 years ago, and looking at time signature and the relationship of the original person versus where these recursives are spread and the time signature of that spread. And also, by the way, the browser that they're using, because the browser the front-end CPE and the recursives all trade in DNS names one way or another. I'll probably get back to it, but it's not something I'm doing right here, right now. Just time and hours in the week and all that kind of stuff. But it's a fascinating question, John, and I haven't let go of that bone. I'll keep on gnawing at it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Oh, by the way, one other thing before I stop here. If you saw Eric Rescorla's presentation in MapRG at the IETF week on Friday, or go look it up, there is a fascinating question because he does an experiment where the Firefox browser emits queries with the DO bit set, and 38% of the queries don't make it out of the farm. They don't get out. And the theory is that something like DNS mask cannot cope with a stub resolver on the inside, making queries to mask with the DO bit set. And that's kind of a scary amount of the metrics of folk using that kind of broken CPE equipment. Go look it up. It's worth having a look at just that one part of MapRG. Or was it DNSOP? Oh, God. Can anyone help me? Other folk were there that week. Eric Rescorla's presentation on the Firefox queries coming from Firefox. Oh,
I can remember the presentation, Geoff. I must admit, I can't remember which working group.
Look, yeah, go search DNSOP at the agenda and MapRG. You'll find it. Alison, thank you, Alison. Well worth looking at, because it was a jaw dropper for me that the broken is that it's so broken at the edge that if you really want to get out of the edge, you must encrypt. Must. And that's kind of this salutary lesson that encryption is actually probably more about broken edge than good privacy. Yes, it gives you privacy, but it tunnels through demented edge, and it's kind of a double win. Yeah. Thank you, John, for that. Yes, that's the one to look at.
Fantastic. Well, there you are. Always good to finish on a sort of mic drop moment. But that was really good. Thank you for taking us through that again, Geoff. And to be honest, even though I was sat in the OARC meeting, I think I picked up some more details by having a second run through, because there's a lot of depth in that data, as always. So no doubt that will trigger some sort of follow-up questions afterwards, but I hope that was informative for anyone. We're out of time, so I will be extremely quick just to highlight two things just to finish off. So I'll skip through and avoid some other stuff, but just very briefly, a reminder that there are some deadlines coming up. There's a proposed IAB workshop on management techniques and encrypted networks, and there's a deadline of the 19th of August for any submissions of papers for that. And also RIPE 85, the deadline for papers is 21st August, so they're sort of coming up relatively quickly in the next couple of weeks. Just to call that out so you're aware. And then finally, the other thing I'll just mention is just sort of time this down with Libor, but I'm expecting that we will do a second sort of presentation reprise next week on DNS over quick on authoritatives. So I'm just waiting for Libor to confirm his availability for that, so you'll see confirmation of that from me in the next couple of days or so, as soon as I'm able to. But with that in mind, as I say, we are over time, so thank you everyone for joining in. I hope that was useful. I'm sure it was. Have a fantastic week, and we'll catch up again same time next week. So enjoy the rest of the week all. Speak to you then. Bye.
Thanks, Andrew. Bye.